So welcome along to this session on Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V compared with vSphere 5.1. It's going to be a fair and balanced analysis and comparison with no bias at all.
Okay, no one else going on the bus?
No.
Okay.
So,
Is that actually here?
sit down, gentlemen.
Sorry for being late.
So welcome along anyway to the session. I'm just going to keep talking until I run out of crap to say. And it's going to be interesting because back in 2008 I did my first ever presentation on Hyper-V to Pub Forum, as it was called back in the day in Dublin. And I felt I was going to get lynched because the audience was mainly VMware customers who well, let's face it, they were fanboys, or V-fanboys as we like to call them, and they got close to violent. So my background is, my name is Aidan Bill. I'm technical sales lead with a value-added distributor in Ireland called Micro Warehouse. So we sell Microsoft licensing and we help Microsoft promote their product. That's my role as a technical sales lead, so I'm kind of like a partner technical advisor in the Microsoft space. So I work with Microsoft partners who are our customers, teaching them about the technology, promoting the technology. So server, virtualization, Office 365, Forefront, System Center. I'm an MVP. There's about 60 odd of us, and there's 1, 2, 4, I think of us in the room with the virtual machine expertise. My background, server, desktop, deployment systems management, and virtualization. And I did first start working with VMware. And before I switched to Hyper-V, I was working with vSphere. I tweet as @Joe_Elway, and I blog as aidan.com. And I've written or contributed to a number of books over the past few years. So I helped Mark Manassi write his Server 2008-2 book. I was a contributor to Microsoft Private Cloud Computing, which you can buy now, and focuses on using a System Center 2012 Virtual Machine Manager to build the fabrics and compute cluster of private cloud with all 3 hypervisors. And currently writing Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V installation and configuration guide, and that will be out in early 2013 and is available for pre-order on Amazon right now. And that's, we estimated it was going to be about 400 odd pages, and we're probably circling about 600 at the moment. So for example, the Dior chapter, we estimated was going to be 40 pages. It ended up being 2 chapters of 40 pages each. And that's just the text, not even the screenshots. And there's a hell of a lot of PowerShell in there as well. So, choices, choices, choices. Which to choose? Microsoft, Citrix, VMware. To be quite honest, Citrix starting to disappear from at least, well, it never really was on our scopes, to be quite honest, in Ireland as a hypervisor. And the only people who were using Zen Server were in the hosting business. But the major players have been using Hyper-V or vSphere. Zen Server, problem with it is you can't get training. At least we couldn't get training when we went looking for it in Ireland or in the UK. So that kind of drew a line through it for us. VMware, we obviously know what the products are from there. So ESXi Free, vSphere, vSphere Hyper Server, Zen Server, and Microsoft Windows Server Hyper-V. So Hyper-V, which you turn on in Server Manager in your Windows Server 2012 install. But we also have the free product, Hyper-V Server, which is free, anyone can download it, has all the scalability and features of Hyper-V on a data center installation. So, we want to talk pricing. That's the first thing we're going to talk about when we compare these products. So, before September 1st, 2012, if you were buying Windows Server, the 3 core SKUs were Data Center, Enterprise, and Standard. A data center cost $4,809 if you were licensing a host, and that was a minimum of 2 processors in that host. So your 2 processors were going to cost $4,809. This is Microsoft's OpenNL licensing for America, which is kind of like the standard comparison pricing. It's also the most expensive volume license you can buy, is an OpenNL license. Enterprise, the price was $2,358 for a server, and Standard was $726 for a server. as of September 1st, when Windows Server 2012 came on the price list, Enterprise was removed from the SKUs. So you can no longer buy Enterprise as a new product. If you're on annuity licensing, you can continue to license it for your existing installs. However, now the two SKUs that you buy, Windows Server 2012 Data Center, Windows Server 2012 Standard. They've changed how the licensing works slightly. So before, Data Center did count processors, and you had to buy a minimum of 2 data centers, 1 per processor. They've changed the licensing now, so if you buy Data Center, you're actually licensing for 2 processors. So 1 data center license equals 2 processors in the host. And they haven't changed the total price. So that 1 data center license now costs $4,809, just as it did for 2 data centers in the past. Standard has increased in price, $882. There's a reason for that. In the past, if you licensed the host for Standard, it gave you 1 VOSI, Virtual Operating System Environment. Basically 1 copy of Windows Server Standard that you can install on the host, and 1 copy of Windows Server Standard that you can install on a virtual machine on that licensed host. And they've increased that from 1 to 2. So now when I license a physical server for Standard, I can install Standard on the host if I choose, and I can install 2 standards as virtual machines on that host. So they've doubled my Standard licensing. The other difference is Standards has all the features of Data Center and all the scalability of Data Center. So it's not limited to 32 gig of RAM, it has failover clustering, and it has live migration and all the other good stuff that Data Center has.
Joe, I have a question about VOSI because it wasn't clear for me. I get 2 VOSI licenses.
Yep.
Okay? If I want to install an additional virtual machine, which is not Windows Server, let's say I want to
Microsoft
install,
doesn't care.
Doesn't care. If I'm installing CentOS or anything.
Microsoft doesn't care.
Okay.
VOSIs are all about server licensing.
Okay.
Windows Server licensing.
You've got software assurance and you've got enterprise today. That converts to 2
To
standards.
do, yes,
does.
yes. In fact, I have
And 2
some
webs
customers.
convert to 1 standard, which is kind of awkward if you've been installing web server on physical boxes. You're basically going to have to virtualize those suckers now. And so this is your comparison of Standard and Data Center. So in terms of how it's licensed, it's identical. So Standard covers 2 processors on a physical box. Data Center covers 2 processors in a physical box. They give you all the features and scalability. The only real differences are the virtual instances of Windows Server. So Standard gives you 2, but you can stack your standards. So I can buy 3 copies of Standard for a server, and that gives me 6 copies of Windows Server to install on virtual machines on that host. So we can stack them up. So if I had Enterprise before, because it came with 4 VOSIs, I get 2 standards through software assurance, so I haven't lost anything.
I had the impression that if you buy Standard, then you're allowed to install 2 virtualized instances, but if you have 2 processors in the host, then you need 2 licenses.
No.
No?
No.
Okay, so Microsoft
It's
doesn't
physical
get it.
processors, that's all we count. And it's at the host level. It's the virtual machine.
So if the host has 2
No,
processors?
you're confusing SQL licensing.
Oh, okay.
And I'm not talking about SQL licensing because I am not touching that with a barge pole. So really, the only difference between these 2 is the number of free licenses that we get. And the sweet spot, you really need to check your local pricing, but the sweet spot seems to be 8 virtual machines. So if you're licensing up to 8 virtual machines, you're better off buying standards for your individual host. And people get this messed up in their heads thinking, do I have to install it 4 times? No, you just install it once. What about my product keys? Do I have to enter them 4 times? No, you just enter in 1 product key. Don't overthink it. This is a big problem people have with virtualization licensing. They overthink it. It's install it once, activate it once, and install the number of virtual machines that's equals to the number of standards you bought your host. And Data Center just gives you unlimited, and there is no asterisk, there's no fair usage rights or whatever. It's as many virtual machines running Windows Server as you can get on that host. That's Data Center. And this Everything I've been saying applies no matter what hypervisor you are using. If you're running VMware, vSphere, ESXi Free, Zen Server, Plesk, Red Hat, Hyper-V, it's the same licensing. You license the host and take advantage of the free VOSIs for the virtual machines. Some people get it in their heads that they're going to buy a copy of standard for a virtual machine. Legally, what you're doing is buying a license for the tin that the virtual machine is on and taking advantage of the VOSI rights. And you also have to remember, licenses have limited mobility. An OEM license can never, ever move. So I cannot move an OEM license from one piece of tin to another. A volume license can move once every 90 days. So you always license a host for the maximum number of virtual machines that it can ever run for 1 second. So if you have a fairly decent sized environment, data center is basically the way to go.
Regarding what you said, there is ways to actually audit what has happened in the past. If I get a call from a customer and tell me, look, can you make a software audit for me?
If you look at the DMMS logs, in Hyper-V, for example, we'd be able to see what web migrations you've been doing. Failover cluster logs, we'll be able to see what's going on there as well. And I'm sure it's probably possible in vSphere as well. And to be quite honest, auditors are not stupid. If they see people buying bunches of standards when they have lots of virtual machines, they'll know to start looking at that mobility stuff. But that's going down a different topic that I don't want to cover today. So what's Hyper-V server? This is if I want to run Hyper-V, I can install standard and enable Hyper-V. If I want to do it, I can do it with data center, so I can install data center and enable Hyper-V. And I have Hyper-V server as well, which is a free SKU. So it's free download, contains every feature of Hyper-V and failover clustering that you get in standard and data center. Absolutely no difference. It doesn't have a GUI, so it's Windows without the Windows. That means you have to basically remotely manage it. You can do local PowerShell if you want. There is a tool on it called sconfig, so you can basically configure the machine from this command prompt style wizard. But it is designed to be managed remotely from System Center, from Hyper-V Manager or Failover Cluster Manager. The big thing about Hyper-V Server is it does not contain any of the free licensing rights. So, although it is free, it doesn't give you any of the free licensing rights for virtual machines. So if I'm running if I want to license 2 virtual machines, I buy a copy of standard. And that gives me my licenses for 2 virtual machines. If I choose, I can install a physical host with standard, it's not costing me anything, and enable Hyper-V. So Hyper-V is effectively free. You're buying the licensing for those virtual machines the same way no matter what hypervisor you're using. So, why would I use Hyper-V Server? Personally, I have never installed Hyper-V Server in a production environment. I've installed it in a lab and got rid of it fairly quickly because I like to have my full GUI, to be quite honest. But there are scenarios where Hyper-V Server makes sense. Virtual desktop infrastructure is a good one. I have no use for my free Windows Server licenses on a VDI host. So why would I buy standard or data center? Why don't I just download the free Hyper-V server and use it? Because I'm not going to be installing Windows Server and VMs on a VDI host. I don't like to cross-contaminate like that. I like to keep them dedicated. So perfect for VDI. If I want to, yeah.
Obviously, Zen, you're not going to be running View on Hyper-V, but
no.
Zen Desktop say that best practice is to run it on Core anyway, so you don't need it.
Yeah, they're just listening to Microsoft marketing. That's a whole other topic. I'm no fan of Core, and the justifications don't make sense, to be quite honest. I say 4 gigs of disk. When I can buy disks less than 300 gig in size, I'll be concerned about that. There's less patching, yes, but I'm probably still going to reboot my server once a month. It's not less patching, it's the number of reboots a month that I'm concerned about. And in a clustered environment, I've got cluster aware updating, so I don't care about that anyway. Am I worried about drive-by attacks and stuff like on Internet Explorer? Anyone who's browsing the internet from their host deserves to get infected.
So fuck 'em.
Yeah, and it's only a few meg of RAM in the end, and to be quite honest, I prefer having a full install in a server type environment. But for economic reasons, Hyper-V server just makes sense in the VDI space anyway. Another one that makes sense is if I'm not running Windows Server VMs. So Hyper-V does support SLES, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, CentOS, Ubuntu, and OpenSUSE. That list has actually expanded in the last few weeks. So they added Ubuntu and OpenSUSE as supported OSs in the last few weeks. Please note, FreeBSD is not listed there. There's been a lot of crap reblogged and tweeted all over the internet, including by Microsoft DPEs, saying that FreeBSD is supported on Hyper-V. No. FreeBSD supports Hyper-V, not the other way around. So they may provide drivers to make FreeBSD work on Hyper-V, but Hyper-V is not supporting FreeBSD. There's a difference. The Hyper-V integration components have actually built into the Linux kernel since version 3.3. So any Linux, such as Ubuntu 12.04 or OpenSUSE, and I believe Red Hat, the next version of Red Hat Enterprise Linux, and they have the integration components built in, so you don't actually have to install anything to take advantage of all the features of Hyper-V with those guest operating systems. And another scenario is a customer who has licensed their virtual machines for older versions of server like 2008 or 2. Maybe they have no intention of upgrading those virtual machines, but they would like to take advantage of the new features of Hyper-V. Then Hyper-V Server is an alternative for them, so they can upgrade their hosts to Hyper-V Server and not have to pay anything to relicense their virtual machines and their hosts.
I think there is another scenario. In the past, I used the free version of Hyper-V for very small customers that had SBS. So SBS is in a virtual, is running virtual. So should the physical server go down, at least I can get that virtual machine up and running on another server.
It's a rare one. It's a rare one. Typically, where we saw Hyper-V with SBS was a customer who was buying a premium add-on, and they got a copy of Standard anyway, and they were installing Standard as their host OS, and then taking advantage of the one free BOSI for Standard as it was back then.
But the idea was, I was using it for customers that had the standard SBS.
Yep. Just abstract the virtual machine from the hardware.
So I'm doing that abstraction, you know.
Yep.
Okay. Now I don't know with Windows Server Essentials. With Windows Server Essentials, you don't get
Hyper-V.
It supports Hyper-V. You don't get virtualization right.
No.
So again, you can still use the same argument.
Correct.
Install
So
it on
it's an
Xbox.
additional scenario. Yeah. So a couple of examples just to explain some of the licensing, because there's a lot of people who just overthink this, and to be quite honest, it's actually simple. This is a machine, pair of processors, and we want to have 4 VMs running Windows Server on them, Windows Server Standard. So the way to license that is buy a pair of Windows Server Standards for the host. Install it once, activate it once, and you get 4 free copies of Standard. You get 2 copies of Standard as VMs for every physical Standard you buy. In the past, you would have bought Enterprise to do this scenario. An Enterprise would have cost you $2,358. Now, you're paying $1,764. Who'd have thunk it? Microsoft licensing getting cheaper. It's a rare scenario. But there you go. Bigger scenario, 10 VMs on a host or more. The way you license that is data center. Buy 1 copy of data center costing $4,809. And you can run as many Windows Server VMs on there as you can physically fit. In terms of processor capacity, memory, IOPS, and storage space, and all that good stuff. Same price as it was before, so the pricing hasn't really changed. And this is whether you're doing Hyper-V or not. So that host could be running vSphere or Zen Server.
This is 5 standard licenses. It would be cheaper, slightly, but it would. This is 880
Okay.
euro.
Okay.
It's a possibility. It would make sense to buy data centers so you can scale.
Yeah, you can scale out.
Yeah.
So you don't have to worry about scaling out with this. So if the customer comes along and says, I want to deploy a new application, they don't have to worry about licensing. They just have to worry about their physical capacity. So it's not Hyper-V licensing, it's licensing of Windows Server for virtualization. That's the key thing. In that scenario, it's up to me to install data center on that host if I feel like it, or ESXi, or Zen server. So, comparing apples with apples, sort of. So the pricing I've taken from Microsoft's OpenNL, and VMware I've taken from their US site. And to be quite honest, in the real world, no one pays these prices. VMware will discount, Microsoft will discount. So it is very difficult to actually say what the real pricing comparison will be. It's case by case. But this is the best pricing we can use for comparison. So if I want to run Windows Server VMs, in this particular case, I've decided to go with Data Center. That's going to be the same on both hypervisors. Because remember, we're not licensing for Hyper-V, we're licensing virtual machines for Windows Server. So, $4,809. Hypervisor, well, Hyper-V is included in my licensing. So if I buy that data center license for my VMs, I can choose to install it on the host and enable Hyper-V. Hyper-V is free. It has no cost. vFanboys don't want to see that. They're like Apple people queuing up, going, hey, we'll get NFC next year, it'll be all good. vSphere, that's going to cost $3,495 per processor. 2 processors in the host probably, so $6,999 or $6,990, so nearly $7,000. So that's $7,000 extra beyond what Hyper-V costs so far. Then we look at our virtualization management. Well, that's System Center. I'll be quite honest here, Microsoft kind of shot themselves in the foot with the System Center licensing changes for 2012 for the small medium enterprise. For the larger business, it's actually pretty good. Because we can't buy System Center as individual pieces. We can only buy these SMLs, the licenses, for all 8 products of System Center. So if I want Virtual Machine Manager, which is the equivalent of vCenter from Microsoft, it's going to cost me $3,603 per host. But the advantage of that is we get all of System Center. So I get my monitoring solution for the host and all the possible VMs I can put on the host. I get a backup solution for the host and all the VMs I can put on the host and their applications. I get automation, I get a service manager for help desk and a self-service portal. The list goes on and on and on. I get antivirus for all my VMs on my host as well. But vCenter, it's included in vSphere, so there's no cost there to do virtualization management from a central console. A small medium environment, maybe I don't need VMM anyway. So if I have 2 or 3 hosts, I'm quite happy using Hyper-V Manager, Payload Cluster Manager, and PowerShell. I do not need VMM, but a larger environment, I will need VMM. Enterprise management. So the reason we have IT in the first place is to provide services and applications to the business. It is not to have servers. And Microsoft have recognized that with System Center. It is all about service delivery and quality of service of that delivery. And we get that through System Center. So we've already purchased that, so no extra cost there. VMware, kind of hard to estimate, because VMware has about 20,000 little products that they've bought over the last 3 or 4 years. And it's almost impossible to figure out what it's going to cost and what products you're going to need. I've certainly had a look and tried to figure out what I would want and need to do automation, monitoring, the whole thing using VMware products. And it's pretty nasty to figure out what does what, to be quite honest. So all I can say there is, you're probably going to need 3 to 5 products, and you're going to pay lots of dollars. So the last time I looked at the monitoring product from VMware, you had to buy packs of 25 VMs. And it was actually more expensive than System Center. And System Center, when you buy it, it licenses the host and as many VMs as you can put onto the host if you buy the Data Center Edition, which I have priced there. Cloud. System Center is Microsoft's cloud solution, so no extra cost. VMware, vCloud Director, price not published. So I guess it's not cheap. It's like when you drive past one of those nice places selling Ferraris. They never put the sticker price on the car. If you walk in and ask what the price is, you obviously can't afford it. So they show you out, bastards. So, continued. What I did find from VMware was the pricing of a bundle called vCloud Suite Enterprise. And they didn't say if it was per processor, so I'm going to be honest there, but I'm going to guess that it was because vSphere itself is per processor. But the single SKU was $11,495. Assuming the host is 2 processors, that's going to cost us $22,990. And the entire Microsoft stack is going to cost me $8,412. Advantage Microsoft. In terms of functionality and managing the entire service and delivery of service, Advantage Microsoft. VMware's monitoring is pretty much all about the server and the virtual machines and the hypervisor. Microsoft's virtualization is from the network all the way through to the end user's perspective of the application and service level agreements. So for me, Microsoft wins hands down. And there was a video that was captured very secretly of a VMware architect talking in a small group about this size several months ago. I've looked for it and I can't find it since. It seems to have disappeared. And he was openly admitting that VMware's solution of buying lots of point products, changing their name to be V something and changing their icons was several years behind Microsoft System Center. So that was kind of interesting to see, an admission like that. It reminded me of when I worked with CA Unicenter, which was what we used to call a framework back in the 1990s. Basically, CA bought a lot of different management products, put them into a single control panel, and said they were integrated. They were about as integrated as that chair in the curtain. Anyway, comparison, 4 key areas. Scalability, performance and density, security, flexibility, and high availability and resiliency. So, look at scalability and density first. So, some interesting studies have come out in the last few years. I saw one report that said 50% of servers out there in data centers are not virtualized. I believe it. I walk into customer sites in Ireland, enterprise size, government size, and they will do a virtualization project, and there is a budget and a scope for that project, and they will virtualize a certain number of machines, and that's it, and they stop. And they say they have done virtualization. So I was at one particular site a few months ago, and we were talking to them about System Center, and I was trying to help them figure out their licensing costs. And I asked them how many hosts they had, and they said, oh, we're fully virtualized, we have 6 hosts. Okay, brilliant. How many physical servers have you got? Oh, 50. 50 physical servers and 6 VMware hosts. I was like, wow, that's really bad. And then I know of another very large site in Ireland that I've heard of. I've not had on-site presence myself, but they have the classic 2006 ratio of 10 virtual machines to every host on their lovely vSphere farm. VMware love them. You can understand why, because of the amount of licensing they're spending as per processor. Ridiculously low densities. So, why are these servers not being virtualized?
I was going to say, I've got 2 medical customers in the United States. Each of them have over 1,000 VMware hosts, and they have almost the exact same number of XenApp hosts, because their IT people are still old school and are under the belief that you never virtualize XenApp. So they have over 1,000 physical XenApp servers. And I was brought in to implement PBS into both environments, and it was a very lucrative contract.
That's crazy.
I agree.
They're costing their employers so much money.
CPU utilization was never more than 2% on any server.
Yeah. I ran IT for a bank that tried to bring down the German economy several years ago. And we ran MOM 2005 back in the day. Like, we deployed it when it was a beta product. And our average CPU utilization across all our servers worldwide was between 8 and 12%, depending on when you looked at it. And I actually blogged about it recently that I could probably, if I had Hyper-V back then, as it is now, I could probably run that entire environment on 2 or 3 hosts. That was 170 servers worldwide. Just crazy. How things used to be, how they are now. We heard yesterday how, running XenApp as a virtual machine just gives you that flexibility and mobility to be able to move workloads around, using load balancing, to be able to do physical server maintenance. So motherboard starts degrading, memory starts degrading. You can get those virtual machines off of there. And to be quite honest, given what processors and memory buses and hypervisors can do now, you know, we can scale out crazy virtual machines, which I'll be talking about soon enough. And so why aren't people virtualizing? Well, we get that. We get people saying, no, the stuff won't run as a virtual machine. It's number 3 there I've got in the slide. But there are 2 valid reasons. There may be hardware interfaces that aren't supported by virtualization. So I actually went into a site 2 years ago, I think it was, to do an evaluation. Almost every physical server they had some sort of comms interface onto the back of it. And to break the bad news to them saying, sorry, this just is not going to work. And they were in a security monitoring business. So their applications basically were talking to alarm systems around the country. So they needed these special interfaces into every server. So they were not virtualization candidates. Then we have the nasty one where some software vendor won't support virtualization, or the virtualization that everyone else wants to use. Oracle comes to mind. Who wants to use Oracle virtualization? Who knew there was Oracle virtualization? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
2 products. That's all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Oracle only supports their products on Oracle virtualization. If you have a problem, you have to reproduce it on a physical box or on Oracle virtualization.
They also bought virtual iron and bring it down.
Yeah. That's a good enough reason to switch to SQL Server or something else. Whatever I came across. And funnily enough, if you're big enough and you say that to them, they'll come up with a custom contract for you. I've heard tell of it.
I actually found also another situation which is stupid. I had partners that they had this like software, and it was installed on a virtual machine because the end customer is all virtualized today, and this software was like crashing and hanging all the time. And when they went to the software vendor, it doesn't support virtualization, and it was a pretty simple software,
Yeah.
some little marking, etc. And the reseller, because we are DC set in that area, the reseller had to install it on a physical machine. It was proven that it also on a physical machine it's actually hanging, and then they admitted this has something to do with virtualization, that their software is not right. What is funny about it is that if I'm a software vendor, I would prefer to certify my software for a virtual environment than for a physical environment. Because if I'm certifying it for a virtual environment, at max I need to test it under Windows, under Hyper-V, under VMware, and let's say under Gem. Okay, if I'm certifying it for a physical host, okay, there might be network card differences, different drivers, different data, etc. So I have more work to certify it on a physical machine than on a virtual machine.
I think part of the problem is that we have the classic misunderstanding where people think they're getting less resources in virtual machines. So they assume their software isn't going to work. In the case of Oracle, I think it's just a strategic thing.
Yeah.
But who knows? Anyway, we'll move on. Let's look at scalability. To be quite honest, if you're running one of the top 10 products, it's not a big issue. How many of you guys are familiar with Jeremy Clarkson? So we refer to these as top gear numbers. So I can buy a Bugatti Veyron with 1,000 brake horsepower, but do I really need it? However, if I buy that Bugatti Veyron and I'm on a motorway or an autobahn driving at the speed limit, I believe autobahns do have speed limits sometimes, and I want to get past another car in front of me, at least I have that horsepower to get past them when I need it. So it's nice to know that if I have a hypervisor that can scale out, it can scale out if I need it. So, comparison. Hyper-V basically has blown the lid off of limits in virtualization. And VMware had to catch up, well, tried to catch up a little bit, didn't quite, with the release of 5.1 Enterprise Plus. So 320 logical processors is the limit per host with Hyper-V in Server 2012 and Hyper-V Server 2012. 320 logical processors is 16 10-core processors with hyper-threading turned on. 16 10-core processors with hyper-threading turned on. Anyone got a physical box with that? Seen a physical box with that? Can you even buy a physical box with that?
I think you can buy
ICL maybe?
a Cisco and bring them together to one server, or
Okay.
also the IBM one that can
Yeah, I
scale
think
to 16
Unisys-
CPUs.
Okay.
It definitely exists because the Canadian guy at Microsoft, what's his name, the virtual guy, said that the figures by Microsoft are there because Microsoft had actually tested them.
Yeah.
So it must exist somewhere in the world.
So basically, that is true. So Microsoft cannot release numbers like this without testing it. So we saw over the last year where these numbers actually increased as time went by.
There are also hardware vendors who, when Microsoft orders a system like this, they will build it.
A custom
design
build.
it.
Yeah, you guys are one of them. Zen Server, on the other hand, 160. vSphere, the free one, 160.
Zen Server is the old specification.
Is it? Well, it's kind of irrelevant now anyway. Taking my life into my hands here by saying that. Hey,
It's still the same as 6.1 anyway.
is it? And vSphere 5.1 Enterprise Plus is limited at 160 logical processors as well. On the virtual machine spec, or actually in the host, we're still there. 4 terabytes of RAM on a host in Hyper-V, 2 terabytes in vSphere Enterprise Plus, and the free one, 32 gigs. The free hypervisor from Microsoft, which is Hyper-V Server, 4 terabytes of RAM in a host. Because Microsoft do not change the features and scalability of the 3 versions of Hyper-V.
And I think it's even true with Windows Pro, Windows 8 Pro, the
Yes.
hypervisor.
Yeah, it is.
Support the same numbers.
Yeah, which only runs on Pro Enterprise 64-bit edition of Windows 8. It's referred to as client Hyper-V. Virtual CPUs per host, 2048 in Hyper-V, 2048 across the vSpheres. And we get into the VMs, and this is where I'm more interested. Virtual CPUs per VM. In Hyper-V, that used to be 4. It's now 64. And that's including the Linux guests. So actually Linux has better support than the older versions of Windows as guest OSs, to be quite honest, which is rather interesting. But Windows 2008 and up, 64 virtual CPUs in a VM. And that is 8 on the free hypervisor and 64 on vSphere 5.1 Enterprise Plus, only Enterprise Plus. Memory in a VM, 1 terabyte of RAM in a VM on Hyper-V. And 1 terabyte over in vSphere, 32 gig on vSphere free. Realistically, you're not going to get that because the host is limited to 32 gig and it's going to consume some memory. We've active VMs per host, 1024 in Hyper-V, 512 across the vSpheres. So if you need those big, dense environments, potentially VDI, software testing, hosting environments, 1024 potentially on Hyper-V. Guest NUMA, so the ability to reveal the NUMA architecture of the physical host. We have that in Hyper-V and across the vSpheres as well. Yep.
That one thing missed in this charter is the maximum snapshotable volume size. It is for virtualization backup. It's on vSphere side you can only snapshot a 2 terabyte virtual disk.
Yeah, 64 terabytes in Hyper-V.
Yeah, and so if you have a really huge file server with
We come to
terabytes of data,
VHDX later.
you can put it on Hyper-V without splitting it with dynamic disks, and
Yeah.
you can backup it with virtual backup tools. And you cannot do this on the vSphere side.
Yeah, it's much more limited on the storage side.
And your backup solution has to support dynamic disk for spanning, and it's horrible.
Yeah, we'll come to storage later. Maximum nodes in a cluster.
I was gonna say, I'm doing a project now for the guy who actually verified those numbers for VMware.
Yeah.
And he said that server cost over $800,000.
Yeah, like I said, they're top gear numbers.
Yeah, yeah. And he also added a 2 terabyte Fusion IO card into the server also,
Nice.
which I think he said was another $300,000.
Small customer?
A very large global financial company.
Nice.
That almost caused the meltdown also.
Yeah, I guess they needed their bailout
Yeah.
price that host.
Yeah.
Maximum nodes, 64 nodes in a Hyper-V cluster, 32 in vSphere. Maximum VMs, that got increased over the year. So it was, before the launch of Server 2012, it was actually 4,000. It's now 8,000 VMs on a Hyper-V cluster is our limit.
Joe.
Aiden, there is no Joe. Joe is not
I,
here.
Unless you're talking demo numbers.
It's Beaver.
Is there a limit on the ratio on how much virtual CPUs I can
No.
have per CPU?
No, it's what your hardware is capable of doing. So that's dispensed with 2012. And it's 3,000 VMs in vSphere cluster. So basically a Hyper-V cluster can scale out to twice as many VMs as a vSphere cluster. In a very large environment, that's going to be important because we have fewer units of administration and deployment. So it simplifies the administration of those environments. So Hyper-V does support bigger OLTP workloads. So for those bigger environments who want to be able to have these massive VMs at the back running the business, Hyper-V supports them. So it was interesting, I did the UK launch of Server 2012 about a month ago. And part of my slide deck was talking about the scalability and the reasons for the scalability. And OLTP is a big deal for the massive corporations. Being able to virtualize those OLTP workloads would be a big deal for them because it means they're no longer bound to hardware. We're able to migrate those workloads, assuming that they've got InfiniBand networking to be able to migrate 4 terabytes of RAM, or a terabyte of RAM around the place. So that's a big deal for them. And we saw the reaction from the people in the audience. They really thought that that was going to be important for them. And we're already, well, for years, we've actually been seeing studies from people saying that RDS workloads run better on Hyper-V and Zen Server than they do on vSphere. I can't say that myself because I don't do that much on the RDS side of things. But considering the guy who wrote it, who's a regular person at E2E, Bernard Tritch, his company wrote it, I believe, the white paper I read a few years ago. I take it seriously. So storage. Hyper-V now supports virtual fiber channel. This is a big deal. It means that we can present raw LUNs to virtual machines, not for the purpose of giving them big LUNs of storage or big units of storage, but for the fact that we can now use virtual SANs to create guest clusters. So this is where we cluster applications within virtual machines. And we can support up to 64 nodes in a Hyper-V guest cluster, whether its storage is on SMB3, so Windows Server 2012 file services, iSCSI, or Fiber Channel. There's no arbitrary limitation there. Virtual Fiber Channel also supports live migration. So Microsoft will not introduce any feature in Hyper-V that prevents live migration. And I can't say the same for VMware, because they have several features that prevent live migration, or vMotion. We have native 4K disk support. So in the past we have used virtual hard disk format, VHD, as our virtual hard disk virtual machines. That's actually a format that Microsoft inherited when they purchased a company called Connectix. And that was where they got Virtual PC and Virtual Server from. That format goes back to the 1990s and was limited to 2040 gigs. Just 8 megs, or 8 gigs behind VMDK, which is limited to 2 terabytes. VHDX is 4K, or can align to 4K, logically and physically. So if I have 4K disks, or 512 emulation disks, so this is where they have 4K sectors instead of 512 byte sectors, VHDX will run much faster, from at least 20% faster to several 1,000% faster, depending on the workload, than 512 byte storage like VMDK. So VMware are way behind on 4K support. VHDX scales out to 64 terabytes. That's actually because of the snapshot. Volume snapshot, the largest size is actually 64 terabytes. So this is the new format we got from Microsoft. We can convert our VHDs to VHDX and back again, but quite honestly, I don't know why you would want to go back again. VHDX 4K aligned, scales out to 64 terabytes, and for the app developers, we can store metadata in there as well. Microsoft use it as their backup target when the server backup, and it's the default type or format, sorry, of disk in Hyper-V in Server 2012 and Hyper-V Server 2012. 64 terabytes. So we can now start putting big data, sorry Didier, into Hyper-V VMs in just a single volume. Where realistically it's important is cloud. Customer deploys a virtual machine via self-service, so IT is not involved in any way, shape or form. And maybe they deploy a 2 terabyte drive and put their database on there. And over time, the database grows, and they start to fill the volume. They log into the self-service portal and extend the size of the disk. No attaching loads of VMDKs or converting it to raw device mapping or pass-through disks or any of that crap. This operating system is built to be a cloud. Hyper-V is designed as the compute cluster for a self-service environment, so we can abstract hardware completely. And VHDX helps us with that. So now we can start putting big data in there. And we can start getting away from pass-through disks or raw device mapping, which I absolutely detest and abhor. We also have support for offloaded data transfer, or ODX. This is a mechanism in a SAN. So we talk, in Server 2012 we hear a lot of talk about using file servers and scale-out file servers for storing our virtual machines, but support for SAN is still there and enhanced. ODX speeds up the process of copying files, such as VHDXs, from a library on the SAN to a host, which is storing its VMs on the SAN. But it's also been used by Microsoft to speed up the process of creating fixed virtual hard disks. So we Hyper-V enthusiasts, we have this kind of almost religious war between dynamic virtual hard disks and fixed virtual hard disks. I'm in the fixed camp, which is correct. And the reason is that fixed virtual hard disks are faster for read performance. We're not worried about write performance. This whole thing about making the blocks larger on dynamic disks and to speed up write performance, we've never cared. Where we really care is fragmentation of dynamic, constantly growing disks, especially when you've got lots of them on the same LUN. They're going to fragment like crazy, and read performance gets impacted because the head has to bounce all over the place to do sequential reads. So ODX, we like it because it allows us to deploy very large fixed virtual hard disks up to 64 terabytes in a tiny percentage of the time it takes otherwise. Basically, Hyper-V creates the first zeroed out block of VHDX, and then the SAN just does the rest of the work. So it basically clones the zeroed out block. So that's going to speed up the process substantially. For the VDI guys, it's going to be a big deal as well, because deployment of new virtual machines from a library or from differencing disks or whatever, it's just going to be accelerated.
Does it also work within the virtual machine? So if I have two servers running on the same storage, which is ODX enabled, and I'm copying 1 gig of data from one virtual machine to another, it actually sends the instruction to the SAN makes the copy locally, and then sends a token back and tell them that it's done.
Should do.
Are you talking about the host?
ODX from the guest.
From the guest.
From the guest. I think I saw a demo by Microsoft.
I think
they
it
did it. The hosts were in two continents, but they were on the same like storage or something like that.
It should, because it is a software level operation communicating with the SAN. It's literally ODX is a passing of a token.
Yes. As far as I know, the Windows, even if you have a third-party application that is using the copy API by Microsoft, the standard, it automatically instantly takes leverage of that. So if I have a 2-year-old application that copy files with the standard Microsoft APIs, and it's obviously on Windows Server 2012, It's leveraging the SAN.
It should do. I can't say myself because I don't have a SAM. I'm
Okay.
in sales.
I'll do the test for you.
Okay, so comparing. So virtual fiber channel supported in 2012, supported in free Hyper-V or free VMware and in vSphere paper. Third-party multipathing. So with virtual fiber channel, we can put up to 4 virtual HBAs into a VM in Hyper-V. And with no third-party stuff, just by using the SAN vendor's MPIO, we can do MPIO of those 4 virtual HBAs. vSphere free, not supported. And vSphere 5.1, you are going to need something called VAMP. vStorage API for multipathing, which is only available to Enterprise and Enterprise Plus. So if you're using standard, hard luck. 4K disk support. Microsoft are the only people to offer 4K disk support, which means if you're buying disks that have 512E, and there's a very good chance that you are using disks that actually have 4K sector platters, and use their firmware to actually hide that fact and obscure it and simulate 512 sector disks, then you're getting reduced performance from your vSphere and your VMDKs. Maximum virtual hard disk size, 64 terabytes from Hyper-V, 2 terabytes from vSphere 5.1. So they're way behind on storage, which personally I don't think is very cloud friendly. Maximum pass-through disk size from Hyper-V, that does actually vary, but realistically you're talking about 64 terabytes because that's the maximum supported size for the new file system Refus and for NTFS. vSphere, 64 terabytes, same reason, snapshots. Offloaded data transfer, yes, from Microsoft, it's built into the operating system, include the free Hyper-V server. vSphere free, no. vSphere 5.1 Enterprise Plus, yeah, if you have Enterprise and Enterprise Plus. So again, if you have standard, sorry. Tad and his company like to make things very, very complicated. So dynamic memory has improved in Hyper-V. So we have this concept now called minimum memory. And the primary audience is actually VDI. So you may have heard of something called MinWin, and there was a leak from Microsoft Amsterdam several years ago related to Windows 8 and Windows Server 2012. We saw this thing called MinWin, and we were all thinking, ooh, is this some sort of new small version of Windows? Something different to the core version? No, it wasn't. It was actually every developer was instructed within Windows to analyze their code and clean up the legacy code. So now Windows 8 and Server 2012 actually have a smaller resource footprint. So when I've been running Server 2012, including back to the betas, my VMs were idle. They were using as little as 256 gig of RAM, or meg of RAM. Gig. The interesting thing is Windows requires 512 megs to boot up. So in dynamic memory, we can set the virtual machine to boot up with maybe a gig of RAM. I always recommend a gig minimum because that's what's required to install SQL. So we set it to boot up with a gig, but if it's idle, we can set it to go down as low as 8 megs of RAM. Now realistically, Windows is never going to get down to 8 megs of RAM, but it may get down to about 200, 300 megs of RAM, and we've drastically reduced the footprint that's being used by idle VMs. And this is going to be important for anyone doing power optimization in System Center, where we can move idle virtual machines onto fewer hosts and start shutting down hosts at night to save more electricity. Then we wake up those hosts again in the morning and start load balancing the VMs. And to have the ability to squeeze down idle VMs onto fewer hosts is a big deal. We have resource metering built into Hyper-V. So we can enable this in our VMs. We can measure CPU in terms of megahertz, memory utilization, disk utilization, network utilization. The network side of things, we can even specify rules to say, listen, we're not going to measure LAN usage, but we are going to measure any usage through a router or to the internet or whatever. That data is actually stored with the virtual machine and travels with the virtual machine as it live migrates, gets backed up, and so on and so forth. And we can pull that data in using PowerShell if we want, however, third-party tools. So there's a guy called Yusuf Ozturk, he's an MVP like ourselves. He's written a free tool that will actually pull that data and present it in a web page. But System Center is also going to pull that data as well. So we can do optional chargeback of resource utilization for the VMs or the services that we're providing. And I also heard another great term at the tech conference recently. It was called report back. So some organizations don't actually cross-charge for their compute cluster and the usage of the compute cluster. What they actually do is they produce reports to show the value that they're providing to the various divisions within the company. So resource metering can be very useful there.
Do you need System Center for this, or?
No, you can turn it on using PowerShell.
Okay.
And you can turn it on a per VM basis if you want, or you can just specify your VM as a star and your host as a star, so you can wildcard it. We have QoS built into the operating system now, so we can start putting in maximum, which is actually always in there, and minimum rules. We can make them absolute in bits per second, or we can make them weight-based, which is basically percentage of bandwidth. So this is useful for something we call converged fabrics. So in the past in Hyper-V, we basically needed a single NIC for every particular role on a clustered host. Now we can put in aggregations of NICs, so maybe 8 1 gig NICs, 6 1 gig NICs, or 2 10 gig NICs, or 2 InfiniBand NICs, and aggregate their bandwidth, load balance across those NICs, and apply QoS for the various protocols or virtual NICs that we want to share that bandwidth with. So that we guarantee a minimum level of service for the various connections. I should mention that we also have NIC teaming now on Windows Server 2012. We do not rely on NIC teaming from Dell, Intel, HP, or Broadcom. In fact, you don't need it full stop. We can aggregate up to 32 NICs in a single NIC team on a physical host, up to 2 NICs in a virtual machine. They can be different vendors. In fact, in real mission-critical environments, you're even recommended to mix vendors of NICs, just in case the Intel NIC becomes dodgy, but the Broadcom NIC stays healthy. Or even the NEC your own, if you feel that way inclined.
We need to be a bit fair over here on QoS. QoS is...
I haven't mentioned VMware. I'm only talking about what's new in Hyper-V. We'll get to VMware. We have data center bridging support as well. So data center bridging, or DCB, is where QoS is applied by physical NICs and switches. So that has been added into Hyper-V. That's particularly important if we're taking advantage of something called RDMA, Remote Direct Memory Access, which we would use if we were using file servers for our storage of virtual machine files. And that basically offloads massive throughput that we can get from 10 gig, 40 gig, or 56 gig networking. So compare these technologies. Dynamic memory, Hyper-V has that. vSphere has its own way of doing memory. It's an overcommitment process. They also have something called shared paging, which as soon as you have a problem, they always tell you to turn off anyway. So it seems a bit silly to actually compare in terms of shared paging. You know, the way Hyper-V and VMware do their memory optimizations, it's different. I can see benefits of the VMware approach, but I can see problems with it. I can see benefits of the Microsoft approach, but I can see problems with it. The problems with dynamic memory are the guest only ever sees the high water mark of memory that's been allocated. So if the VM boots up with 1 gig, and you open up Task Manager, you see 1 gig, even if the VM can go up to 1 terabyte. So in a hosting environment, that's obviously going to be painful because you're going to get help desk calls from customers going, I'm paying for 8 gig of RAM, but I can only see 1 gig. Problems. The VMware approach, they take the opposite approach. They lie to the virtual machine and say, hey, you booted up with 8 gig, but really you're only using 1. And they have to live up to the commitment, which means if they have contention for memory on the host, they have to physically page, blind second level paging, which is the worst kind of paging you can do. And that drastically reduces performance. And typically I would say to people, if you're going to have a paging file like that, you're going to want to put it on an SSD, and enterprise class SSD as well, which is going to cost you money. At that point you may as well just put RAM into the damn host. Resource metering, we have that in Hyper-V, but we do have that across the various vSpheres as long as you're using vCenter. Quality of service, yes in Hyper-V, yes on Enterprise Plus version of vSphere 5.1, but not on the free product. DCB, yes across the board, except for Zen Server.
Aiden.
Yeah.
I think that Hyper-V has QoS on the storage, which Hyper-V don't.
No, the other way around.
Hyper-V has on storage.
No.
VMware has it on storage.
Yes. So where we do it in the Hyper-V world is we actually use System Center. We use Pro. So if we have a HBA, for example, that has Pro Management Pack, we would actually enable the Pro Management Pack from that vendor using System Center. And then we use the hardware's view of what's going on to load balance of the storage activity of the virtual machines. But there is no QoS for fiber channel iSCSI in Hyper-V. At a virtual machine layer, which there is from vSphere. So I have to be fair to vSphere on that one. Okay, networking. The virtual network in Hyper-V has been replaced by a completely manageable and extensible virtual switch in Hyper-V. So it is a layer 2 device. It supports things like PVLANs, ARP, QoS within the switch itself, port forwarding, ETW tracing. It's manageable using PowerShell and WMI. It supports things like DVMQ. It's a pretty impressive device. It is extensible with third-party solutions. So we have 3 types of extension. We have monitoring solutions. So there's a company called InMon that have a product that will monitor virtual machine traffic from within the virtual switch. We have firewall solutions. So there's a firewall filter. So there's a company called Five9 out there who have a virtual firewall which we can add in addition to the other type of filter. We also have what's referred to as a forwarding filter. And that makes the Hyper-V extensible switch look like a different and act like a different switch. There are 2 vendors right now that have products for that. Cisco, vBlock ain't that exclusive anymore, and NEC. Cisco's product is called the Cisco Nexus 1000V, and pretty much makes Microsoft Virtual Switch into a Cisco switch, manageable from the Cisco administration console. So you can drag and drop your policies onto virtual machines from within the Cisco management console. The NEC solution does the same thing for their OpenFlow solution, and both of these products are used in Microsoft's larger private cloud architecture, and there are other third parties who add on as well. I know of, and I'm not going to name because I'm not supposed to know, of 2 other hardware companies who are producing extensions for the Microsoft Virtual Switch. So when we start comparisons, extensible switch, Hyper-V, yes. vSphere, I call it the disposable virtual switch. Because in vSphere, yes, there are 2, actually 3, because IBM have announced something, switches which can replace the vSphere switch. Obviously the vSphere switch is not that important if it's replaceable or disposable. PVLAN support, yes, across the board, except for the free product from VMware. ARP spoofing protection, yes, from Microsoft. That's actually been there since Service Pack 1 of 2008 or 2, but they didn't really talk about it back then. But it's now talked about with Server 2012, but not all that much. But that requires partner products from vSphere. DHCP snooping protection, yes, in Hyper-V. We can actually prevent virtual machines from being active DHCP servers, and just with a checkbox. Again, partner solutions. Virtual port ACLs, yes, partner solutions in vSphere. Trunk mode to virtual machines, so we can pass up a trunk to virtual machines so they can filter VLANs within the guest operating system. So potentially we enable a NIC team within a guest OS and let it actually filter different team interfaces for different VLANs. We can do that in Hyper-V. You can't do that in vSphere, full stop. With port monitoring, again, that is something that's limited to the Enterprise Plus edition of vSphere. With port mirroring, so we can actually forward inbound and outbound communications to a virtual NIC, to another virtual NIC, where we can run a monitoring solution. So that could be particularly important in pharmaceutical or medical, where there's very strict change control. You can't install a network monitoring solution onto a machine that's having a problem. That is limited in the free edition of vSphere and can be done on the Enterprise Plus edition of vSphere. Dynamic virtual machine queuing is where we have a processor or a core scalable solution for accelerating inbound traffic to virtual machines. It uses RSS queues on your physical NICs. It is supported on Hyper-V, and it's NetQ on vSphere 3 and 5.1 Enterprise Plus. Actually 5.1 full stop. IPsec task offload. IPsec is where we use rules in the guest operating system to encrypt and decrypt traffic automatically. It can be useful, again, pharmaceutical, hosting environments, any environment where you need to secure traffic between a client and a server. IPsec is very processor intensive, so if we have lots of virtual machines doing that, they can eat up the processor on the host. Some NICs have the ability to actually offload that workload, so the host processor is not being overloaded by IPsec encryption or decryption. Hyper-V can take advantage of that by offloading IPsec encryption and decryption computation to the NIC. vSphere cannot do that. Single root I/O virtualization is another hardware offload. It uses a thing called a virtual function on the physical NIC to present the NIC directly to the virtual machine, bypassing the hypervisor. So when the hypervisor is copying packets from the physical NIC through its switch to the virtual machine, there is a processor cost to that. There is a memory cost to that. It also introduces latency. And that's true whether you're using Hyper-V or vSphere. In fact, vSphere added support for SRIOV using direct path I/O before Microsoft did in Windows Server 2012. Basically, SRIOV allows us to have virtual machines with lower network latency and more densely populated hosts with network-intensive virtual machines without punishing the processor. Hyper-V supports it, and supports it with live migration. Direct path I/O eliminates the possibility of vMotion. So again, Microsoft living up to their rules. No introduction of new features that prevent live migration. Unfortunately, vMotion don't believe that flexibility of your infrastructure is that important, even though they invented vMotion. Storage encryption, we can turn on BitLocker on our volumes where we're storing our virtual machines, whether they're local volumes or in a cluster. Not the same with vSphere. So physical security is not important to VMware by the looks of it. I read a story a few months ago that the US military are actually using Hyper-V in their forward operating bases. They use BitLocker to encrypt the hosts. And their plan is, if they have to abandon a forward operating base, they don't have time to remove the servers, to take the disks, to do any DBAN, wiping of the disks or anything like that. So they're BitLockered. AES 256-bit encryption. Perfect. And to make the machines unusable to the enemy, so to prevent them from installing their own hypervisor, like vSphere. What they actually do is they take a highly explosive grenade, a couple of them, pull the pins, put them in the rack, and run. And their disks are shredded. And BitLocker's encrypted the data, so it's secure. So on the security side of things, we have BitLocker, which is important. Seeing as we're in Germany, I added this bottom one. Hyper-V in the last two versions has achieved EAL 4+ security certification from the German government. So there is a department whose name I am not going to try pronounce. They're called the BSI. Bundesamtes für Sicherheit in der Informationstechnik. Is that close?
A bit. Bundesamt für Sicherheit in der Informationstechnik.
That's what I said.
Yeah.
Ich möchte ein Bier, bitte. That's my German.
You will have one.
So that's pretty important. And be fair, vSphere has achieved that certification in the past. But it speaks to Hyper-V that the German government actually believes it to be a secure product. They've actually torn it apart and looked at it. However, the MDK is broken. This story broke a few months ago, back in May actually, and it still hasn't been fixed. The VMDK format is broken. So in a public cloud or even a private cloud where the customer is allowed to upload their virtual machines into the cloud, you can craft your VMDK to open any binary file on the host. So from within the guest operating system, this reporter actually was able to access the data or the password file on the host. And of course, Linux password encryption is not known to be secure, and it's just a matter of a basic brute force attack, and they've got the password of our host at that point. And if they can get at the password file, which is an encrypted binary file, they were able to get at any binary file and do whatever they wanted to the host, which is pretty damn scary. Hyper-V, on the other hand, has never had a breakout attack, unlike vSphere. This problem with VMDK still exists. They will have to re-architect the VMDK format and tell their customers to convert all their disks if they want to fix this, which is pretty damn scary. Flexibility. So myself and another MVP who's supposed to be here this weekend, but he was sick, unfortunately, Hans Friedebert, and another guy who I call Captain Cloud, Damien Flynn, who's a cloud and data center MVP. We run something called the Great Big Hyper-V Survey. It's actually open at the moment. In the Great Big Hyper-V Survey, we basically ask people who are using Hyper-V or considering using Hyper-V for their opinions on lots of different things. How they're using Hyper-V, why they're using Hyper-V, are they using anything else, are they using System Center, how are they using it, where are they experiencing problems. It's open right now, and we appreciate anyone who takes part. Believe it or not, Microsoft have actually read the results of this in the past, and we have impacted Hyper-V in the past. MVPs are one of the groups that really can influence the direction of product. In 2011, we asked a question: why did you do virtualization? And we expected a massive number of people to say to reduce costs. And when the numbers came in, I was gobsmacked. Just under 30% said they did virtualization to reduce costs. I expected that to be 80+%. That seemed like the prime reason to me to do virtualization. But just basically a percentage behind, people said their primary reason to do virtualization was to increase flexibility and agility for their workloads. We're rerunning the survey right now, and so far, 25% are saying their primary reason for virtualization was flexibility and agility, and trailing that was reduced costs. Maybe it's the cost of storage, I don't know. But agility is a big deal for people. Being able to move a workload independent of hardware and physical storage boundaries is very important to people. That's the role of vMotion, that's the role of live migration. And fair dues to VMware, they did invent vMotion. And Microsoft gave us live migration after the interesting experience of quick migration in 2008. They gave us live migration in 2008 or 2. So, live migration, faster, so they've actually changed the algorithm and how it copies pages of memory. It prioritizes inactive pages, and then does the active pages last to have fewer iterations through the copy and synchronization process. We now have live storage migration, so we can move the storage of virtual machines from one LUN to another, from one SAN to another, from one folder to another, from one cluster to another, from one server to another. We have shared nothing live migration. Microsoft invented this, and VMware had to play catch up with 5.1. This was all announced in September of last year by Microsoft. Shared nothing live migration allows me to vMotion or live migrate a virtual machine and its storage between two non-clustered hosts that don't have any shared storage. It allows me to move virtual machines between clusters, something that vSphere 5.1 cannot do. With live migration, I can move virtual machines between non-clustered hosts in a cluster, and between clusters. So live migration is the flexibility mechanism. Network flexibility.
Aiden, I have a question on storage migration.
Yeah.
If I'm just moving if I'm leaving it on the same volume, I'm just moving the folder.
Yeah.
I'm reorganizing.
You're doubling your IOPS and you're temporarily doubling your disk space while the copy process is going on. So Hyper-V never burns its bridges when doing live migration. And the other promise from live migration, beyond no new features breaking it or preventing it, is that if something goes wrong during live migration, the virtual machine always remains running. So the original virtual hard disk is not erased until the virtual machine is actually up and running on the new virtual hard disk in its new location. So it's not actually a move, it's a copy and erase.
It's not intelligent enough that it says, okay.
It is intelligent.
No, but it doesn't detect that you're just moving the folder within the same volume
You can't
and
do that.
adjust the NTFS.
You wouldn't be able to do that. No. And the file system wouldn't handle that. Then there's file locks and all that sort of thing going on. So it's an actual safe copy and erase afterwards once the actual live migration is completed. So we have secure isolation, so we can use VLANs if we want. And we've got PVLANs. We have flexibility, so we can move virtual machines wherever we want. And a seamless integration with all this stuff as well. We also have something called network virtualization. That's the Microsoft label for it. The industry is calling it software-defined networking. It was interesting. A couple of weeks before Microsoft make Server 2012 available, and VMware goes and buys a company for $1.2 billion, does the same thing. It's just they had no customers. VMware felt desperate to have a solution like this. And yet another V product with an icon change that's integrated into vCloud. So the concept with network virtualization is that we can take virtual machines and abstract their IP addresses from the physical network. So we're doing to network IP addresses what we have been doing to servers for the last 10 years. We're virtualizing them. So we could have Blue Corporation, Red Corporation using the same common IP addresses and using either PowerShell or System Center or potentially other third-party solutions. We create policies for our customers to abstract or translate their IP addresses. There's two mechanisms for this. There's one called GRE and there's another one called IP address rewrite. One is more scalable than the other and performs better, and the other one is ready now. And when I say ready now, it's actually the network vendors is the limitation here. A lot of what's been done in hypervisors at the moment is very much future-proofing. And we can take those virtual machines and put them with their existing IP addresses in their guest OSs onto the same physical network. And they can live beside each other and continue to communicate via virtual gateways, which could be appliances or could be filters in the Hyper-V extensible switch, or even just traditional routers. And they can coexist on the same physical VLANs. And they're securely isolated from each other. And that's what network virtualization is all about. Where we can use this with live migration is we can have in a data center one network footprint that has an IP address range. And virtual machine that's running in that IP address range has traditionally been bound to that IP address range for application reasons. Sure, we could do a shared nothing live migration to another network footprint, but the application would go offline because its IP address in the guest OS is no longer valid. With network virtualization, I can create a policy in advance for any virtual machines that get moved over, and I storage live migrate the virtual machine to the different, I shared nothing live migrate the virtual machine to the different network footprint, and the application stays online and available. So now, within the data center, I have no boundaries for live migration, which I cannot say the same for with vMotion. So, VM live migration, yes across the board, except for free vSphere. Hyper-V server, again, all the same features and scalability as a paid-for product. Simultaneous live migrations are now supported by Hyper-V. In fact, it's in theory unlimited. The default number in the console is 2, and it's up to you to tune how many simultaneous live migrations you want to do. In reality, you do have a limit. It's what your network can handle, and it's what the host processor can handle as well, because live migration creates system interrupts. The more simultaneous live migrations you do, the more system interrupts there are hitting the processor. But Microsoft are not putting some arbitrary limit like VMware have. So they're limiting 4 simultaneous live migrations on 1 gig networking and 8 on 10 gig networking. And beyond that, they don't consider things like Roki, which runs at 40 gigabits per second, or InfiniBand, which runs at 56 gigabits per second. So in the larger data center, you can still only do 8 simultaneous live vMotions. Microsoft will say, well, if you've got a team of InfiniBand NICs running at 128 gigabits per second, you've got 4 terabytes of RAM in your host, have at it. Get your VMs off there as quickly as you can. Live storage migration, yes. Certainly all versions of Hyper-V, but only in Enterprise and Enterprise Plus from VMware. Network virtualization built into the box. It's a cloud operating system built into the box for Hyper-V. But you're going to need VXLAN from Citrix for vSphere, or you're going to need their new acquisition, which will be called V something or another. And whatever the name of that company was that nobody ever heard of before, but something was valued at $1.2 billion. HA and resiliency. So HA is not live migration, HA is automatic failover between hosts. We have support for incremental backups now in Hyper-V, and we didn't really have that on cluster shared volumes in a cluster before. So now we have more efficient backup, just grabbing the changes of our virtual machines rather than the entire virtual hard disk. We have Hyper-V Replica, built-in asynchronous interval-based replication of running virtual machines. Free. It supports Kerberos authentication and SSL authentication. So if a hosting company wants to sell disaster recovery as a service, or DRaaS, they can. It's just built in. And it was designed for all the flakiness of commercial broadband. And I mentioned integrated NIC teaming earlier, up to 32 NICs of different vendors. Clustering. No one touches Hyper-V now. 64 nodes, 8,000 virtual machines. Twice what VMware are able to do. It's flexible, so we can do guest clustering using iSCSI, virtual fiber channel, and SMB storage. Up to 64 nodes in a virtual guest cluster. We talked about BitLocker of cluster shared volume earlier. And cluster shared volumes has now been enhanced, so it's more integrated into our storage using things like ODX as well. And we have support for things like on-map and trim. We have 3 levels of availability, so we have HA hosts, HA guest virtual machines, and HA applications within the virtual machines using guest clustering. Cluster-aware updating allows us to orchestrate the patching of our hosts. It's built into Windows Server, so we don't need any third-party applications. And we can do this automatically from within the cluster, or we can do it manually from Failover Cluster Manager. And that allows us to patch the hosts without any downtime to the services being provided by the virtual machines. We now have failover prioritization in Failover Cluster Manager, so we can set virtual machines to be high, medium, and low. So we actually start them up in the order that we want. And we can set affinity and anti-affinity rules for our virtual machines. Yes, that's something that has been in VMware for a long time, and to be fair for VMware, it's a hell of a lot easier to do affinity and anti-affinity rules in vCenter than it is in Failover Cluster Manager. See, I'm not just killing VMware. They do some things well. So the big difference here, realistically, is guest OS application monitoring, which is something the Failover Clustering Manager can do. So we can configure a cluster to actually monitor the health of a service within a virtual machine, or for specific events in event logs in the virtual machine, and get the cluster to either restart the virtual machine or fail it over to another host. So it's another action that we can do. If you have System Center, you're better off doing that using Operations Manager and Orchestrator, to be quite honest. So Operations Manager would detect the issue and kick off a recovery action using Orchestrator. And using Orchestrator, we can do very complex actions if we need to, including health checking what's going on and escalating the actions, and eventually bringing in a person to actually deal with the issue if it's still unresolved. And we've covered most of this already. So limitations here. On the vSphere side of things, 16 nodes on an iSCSI guest cluster, 5 nodes on a fiber channel guest cluster. And I'm not sure about this, but I believe vSphere virtual machines using virtual fiber channel cannot be vMotioned. But feel free to correct me on that. That is not the case with Hyper-V. So Hyper-V virtual machines with their 4 virtual HBAs with NPIO enabled can live migrate their hearts out if they want. And we can build guest clusters using file server storage. So SMB3 storage now rivals the speed of other types of storage connectivity. And Didier will talk his heart out about that if you let him. He'll even sing about it. At this point I usually hear, well, Hyper-V doesn't have fault tolerance or FT. FT is a great big chocolate kettle. It looks good, sounds good, but I would not want to boil water with it. FT is a process where a running virtual machine is constantly being replicated, including its memory and its processor, to another host. So if this host blows up, the virtual machine is already running on another host. So there's no downtime that you normally get with HA. However, FT is extremely limited. Now, FT sounds like something you want to do with a mission-critical VM. I cannot have downtime for it. However, I can only have 4 FT VMs on a single host. An FT-enabled VM can only have 1 virtual CPU. It obviously isn't that mission-critical if it only has 1 virtual CPU. We have to turn off second-level address translation for that VM. So that's where we offload memory mapping using EPT from Intel or NPT or RVI from AMD to accelerate memory processing for a virtual machine, which impacts the processor of the virtual machine. So again, that mustn't be a mission-critical virtual machine. Hot plug and play of hardware in the virtual machine is disabled if you're using FT. Again, that's a bit of an issue if you want to add disk or anything. You cannot do snapshots of that virtual machine. Personally, I don't think that's a big deal. But the next one is, if you enable FT on your virtual machine, you cannot do VCB backups of that virtual machine. That's an issue. That means we can't use our friends at Veeam or other similar backup solutions to back up that virtual machine. You have to put a backup agent into the guest OS and do a traditional backup, which is more expensive and more complicated and a pain to do. We'd rather do host level and storage level backup. And it's only in Enterprise Plus. And I've never come across a client actually using FT personally. And I've spent the last 3 months training consultants in Ireland, and not one of them has seen FT in the real world. So FT, it's a bit of a joke of an argument to me. It's a chocolate kettle. It's a creation of marketing people. It's like buying a compact camera that does 20 megapixels. 20 megapixels, it's a joke. It's all about marketing, to be quite honest, at that point. So, some of the objections. We have load balancing in vSphere. We have power optimization in vSphere. Can you do that in Hyper-V? Well, actually, we do that with System Center. So System Center has dynamic optimization and power optimization. Dynamic optimization is the equivalent of DRS in vCenter. Power optimization, I think it's called power optimization in vCenter or in vSphere as well. It's a similar concept, moving virtual machines onto fewer hosts and shutting down hosts and waking up hosts the following morning when they're needed. vSphere has the ability to deploy a Hyper-V, or not Hyper-V, vSphere has the ability to deliver ESXi or vCenter to, or vSphere to a bare metal host. We can do the same using VMM. And the way it actually does it is very clever. And it actually delivers the Hyper-V installation in a virtual hard disk. So it formats a roll on the tin and boots the virtual machine to a virtual hard disk, which is great because it means if I want to replace that host OS, I basically just drop in another virtual hard disk and boot up with that instead. It just has to be the same name. I actually use that in my labs, which is very handy for getting myself a fresh host very quickly. I just have to copy one file.
But I think that's only available on Service Pack 1, so it does still on beta.
No.
2008 or 2 and up. System Center is Service Pack 1 support, or Service Pack 1 is required for support for Server 2012. Yeah. FT, I've talked about that chocolate kettle. So, personally, I find VMware's products confusing. Very confusing. I have no idea, without going back to this PowerPoint deck, which version does what. You know, sometimes Standard does it, sometimes Enterprise and Enterprise Plus does it, sometimes only Enterprise Plus does it, sometimes even the free product does it. It feels like to me it's like a trap for salespeople to like reel you in and force you to do upgrades. There's Hyper-V. If there's a feature for Hyper-V, it's in the free product all the way through. The only difference between the free product and the others, realistically, is the free instances of Windows Server in your virtual machines on the host. That's the only difference. So, from my perspective, I'm not biased, Hyper-V wins across the board. Scalability, clearly. If you have the hardware, Hyper-V scales out. Security, BMDK is broken. Hyper-V has gotten same certifications from the German government as vSphere. Multi-tenancy wise, it's built to do multi-tenancy, 2012 is. Flexible infrastructure, we've got more live migrations than you could hope to do. We've got more than vSphere can do with vMotion. High availability and resiliency, we can do the same or more than vSphere. And FT is a non-starter. So for me, Hyper-V is a more complete virtualization platform, and as I started with at the start of the deck, it's free. So you could spend your money on vSphere, or you could spend your money on an enterprise management system and cloud system with System Center.
So just on System Center, I heard lots from Microsoft and Pacific about how improvements in System Center and VMM 2012 increased scalability for VDI on Hyper-V. What are the changes and what have they done?
So the core changes are actually these things called timers and how they impact how VMM is behaving. So in the past, 2008 or 2, these timer mechanisms were very, very frequent. And with the constant change that you get in a VDI environment, because it's not as static as a server environment, and there was a lot of stuff going on that VMM had to track and monitor, because VMM...
It would just fail the jobs all the time.
It could, yeah, stuff would time out.
Yeah.
And it had to be tuned. There was a guy from Redmond who actually blogged about how to tune VMM 2008 or 2, but it still only scales to a certain limit. Whereas 2012, they've done quite a lot. And I'm guessing that Thomas might know a bit more about that. Do you know anything about the changes to the tuning for VMM 2012?
Yeah, in SP1 they changed a lot.
Yeah.
Like if you shut down a virtual machine with Hyper-V Manager, it's like instantly appearing in VMM 2012 SP1.
Okay, so you reckon it definitely has to be SP1, not just 2012?
Well, 2012 definitely had engineering changes for VDI, because that was one of the big pieces of feedback they got from the TAP community.
Well, you couldn't use it really.
It just didn't scale.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, there was a lot of improvement, or there is a lot of improvement coming with SP1. Well, still there is, yeah, it's like instantly changing things.
Yeah, this isn't a traditional service pack, which is just bug fixes. System Center Service Pack 1 is bringing a lot of change to embrace what's been done with Server 2012. It's required to support Server 2012, but they also took it as an opportunity to do more engineering for other scenarios that they didn't get to do in the original System Center 2012 release. So they've taken what they did and they continue.
But interestingly, so I tried it in our lab, and I've seen that VMM SP1 is only for Server 2012, so there is no chance to install it on 2000 R2, as far as I know from the beta version.
That's probably correct, yeah.
You have to install it on 2012.
The problem is I didn't get it, because if a customer already has a System Center on 2000 on R2,
yep,
and you can't upgrade.
There's never been an upgrade option for VMM.
Yeah.
It's always been a migration. So anyone who had 2008 or 2 actually migrated to 2012, and still be the same again with this service pack. It'll be a migration. And it's a simple enough migration process anyway. So fire up a new VM with 2012 and then migrate your VMM over to it. So that's for Jeff. He's happy now.
I have another question. On the first slides was saying that there are some studies that Hyper-V can run larger workloads for Citrix and RDS environments.
So,
Are there any references for that?
I cannot remember the name of the company. It's a Dutch company, and I believe Bernard Trich runs from it. Is it Logic?
So you're talking about PQR and logging consultants.
Yeah.
So if you talk about VRC,
It's reality check.
Yeah.
Virtual
VRC,
reality.
Was it?
right?
It's several years ago I saw that. So that is the end of the presentation. And this went a lot better than when I first presented on Hyper-V back in 2008 in Dublin. I thought I was never going to get out of there alive, unless you go for the sneak attack afterwards. So myself and the other MVPs are going to be working with Alex on a masterclass. So if you want to learn more about our RDS in 2012 and Hyper-V and some of the practical side of things and the design side of things, talk to Alex and he'll have all the details. I think it's kicking off at 4 o'clock this afternoon and it's continuing tomorrow morning. And thank you very much.